So James, I've been thinking a lot about what you said in the first installation of your video about how the camera is a lot like a Ghostbuster, and it sort of sucks your energy up. And there's a lot of ways to look at that. There's definitely an energy transfer going on. And I was thinking so much about what it meant for it to be a Ghostbuster, a black hole basically that takes the energy that's here into another world where it can become anything. And it's very difficult to ever predict how I'm going to be interpreted because everybody sees their own reflection. And so, what can I really say to anybody but myself? But then, when you really understand somebody, it seems like all selves become the same. And I started reading Carl Jung's autobiography, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, and I'm really glad I did because, maybe you could say this is just projection because I want to do basically exactly what he did. And so I'm projecting myself onto the description of his own life, and that's possible, but the way he's describing his inner psychic development, I just recognize myself. And maybe it's just because he is a brilliant psychologist giving a description of every self. He's being a scientist of the mind and giving the story of the individual. Because his psychology was certainly, it was in a historical context in which the human being was becoming, it had already become democratized, but now it was becoming mediated. It was becoming part of a mass. The masses, that whole concept never even arose until the 19th century, maybe the late 18th century. But the idea of being part of society is a new phenomenon that, when it first began, was more participatory. But now that media has become so powerful that the average American watches 5 hours of TV a day. I spend 5 hours of my day on the internet at least, probably a lot more than that when you can include work. But we're being overwhelmed by media now, so the mass is created. The idea of what society is now created um, for a lot of people by a single source, or the six major um, corporations that control 70% of the media that reaches the eyes of Americans. But then there's YouTube, and I guess that's changing it, maybe. YouTube is already sort of leaking into the mass mind because the videos that are more pop culture oriented get the most hits. But there's these hidden alleyways and deep dark undercurrents on YouTube that are very enlightening, paradoxically. And it seems like that's the one thing they never tell us when we're brought up into this world, that for a psyche that hasn't actualized itself, life itself is a complete contradiction. You're supposed to make something of yourself when it's obvious that because you exist, you will not exist. Because you have been born, you are going to die. Because you are alive, you are also going to die. And so, what are you going to build that you're going to be able to take with you? Nothing. And that's a total contradiction. So if you're a human being that's raised like most human beings are, to be not only afraid of life, but in competition against it, trying to figure out how to defeat it, or at least push it off for as long as possible. But why is that? And I think that's basically, a psychologist is a product of a couple thousand years of philosophy. Finally, the philosophers needed a way to heal themselves from the rift that they had created between their own mind and nature, and that's psychology. It was of necessity. Scientific materialism was the pinnacle of the human mind in the 18th century. The 19th century, it got challenged by lots of people, lots of poets and poet philosophers. And Freud tried to synthesize what they had found, that everything was basically this dead matter which followed causal law, and life was explained by that same dead matter, driven by sex to evolve. So it's death and sex, and even sex is it's beneficial and evolution takes place because of natural selection. So built into the very process of the evolution of life is death, and without death there can be no selection and therefore no evolution. So the organism is never just alive. It's not never just a pattern of life. It's also a pattern of death. It's a graveyard. It's a whole history of struggle with an environment. But then that in itself is another contradiction. A self-aware organism in an environment full of other self-aware organisms. How's that for a crazy loop of experience? How can there be all these individual experiences in one cosmos? How does that happen? And if it does happen, what is it that is happening? Is it as real as something else that's not happening? Is life as real as death? Or if they're never separate, what do we think life is? We can invent a dualism and say that life is when the consciousness inhabits the matter, and death is when the consciousness leaves into eternity. And that makes perfect sense. But then it's still a contradiction. Why matter? And why consciousness? Isn't matter also conscious? Not of itself, but it's conscious in the sense that you can see that a certain pattern or habit occurs whenever rocks fall down the side of a cliff. They lay themselves out on the ground in a certain way. And that's intelligent. They're obeying a pattern of development that can be, predicted over time. It obeys these regular forms of development. So even dead matter has intelligence. Plants grow themselves so they can absorb light. They can transfer energy in this very chemically excitatory way that creates an autopoietic system, a self-creating organism which defines its own boundary, which creates a membrane around itself, and a nervous system with which to cognize the world. And then we think that cognition is typing a bunch of keys on a keyboard. That's the basic metaphor for computational cognitive science. That I'm speaking now, but I'm really just typing on a keyboard. And even to move my arms and stuff, I'm typing on a keyboard. There's a little part of my mind in here that's... because we want to reduce all of this vagueness into something very concrete, even though it's really actually abstract because we created this alphabet. And so we reduce reality to our systems of symbols and say it's concrete and it makes sense and it's rational and it's logical. We don't realize we created this system of symbols, so for it to be logical is nice and it's beautiful, but how does it apply to the world, to being, to consciousness, to the psyche, the whole human being, not just the physiological body and the brain, or not just the soul, the spirit, and not just the other, like the people, the society, but the whole psychic being, which includes society, the ego. It includes the unconscious as one being, and everybody is that being. There's one psychic being, and each one of us is it.